The 9/11 attacks was basically it was a few hours of the intense tipping point data collation, and then we slipped into a week-long release period. So the effects of what we're looking at is considerable and much larger than what we had seen for 9/11. Under the circumstances, of course, that instantly makes your mind think nuclear war, etc. But it appears to be U.S.-centric, and then at this point, as near as we can tell, it spreads out around the planet from a U.S. kind of spark or initiation. Might be a false flag attack or something along those lines.
What about the November elections?
November 2nd.
Okay. Yeah, and those would be. It would work if the elections were called or canceled after the effect. We're talking a big tipping point, something that again alters life as we know it. As screwy as it sounds, as weird as life is, and is going to be in early November, it will be very much different after November 11th.
But you have no idea what it could be? I mean, could it be an asteroid that smashes into the planet?
I doubt that kind of thing, because we're going to have release language that's going to be of a continuing intensity in terms of how fast it sheds emotional tension. So, and this is my monkey mind, and this is where we start getting into the area of potential errors, so I'll let you know that right off. If we were going to see something like an asteroid, I presume we would see a mega release drop. And while we have a large release drop after the tipping point, it's not as severe as I would presuppose that something like a city killer asteroid would cause. Does that make sense?
If, let's say, a group of astronomers chat amongst each other about the possibility that an asteroid that they have found that we don't know about is coming our way and could hit within the next few months, would you be able to pick that up?
Yes. If it was in a position to where the language itself had in some way leaked out into a public forum or a forum that allowed registration. We sweep lots of things. So if they're out there chatting about it, we don't do emails. Occasionally we might catch an email, for instance, if it was quoted in a forum. So it depends on where they're chatting about it. However, would we pick it up in terms of a psychic impression coming? I just don't know. There's so much we don't know about this work, I just couldn't say.
The other problem that comes along with the November tipping point is in the case of 9/11, we had tipping point, we had the week the skies were shut down, and then sort of life got back to usual. The problem we've got, we could talk about it now, I guess, is something that Clif has labeled the gap, which frankly has us both, I won't say freaked out, but scared, worried, concerned, and planning.
Is this the data gap you're talking about?
Correct.
Yeah.
Okay, what is this?
Well, let's first say that we considered our emotional data, which drives the temporal impact of the data, in three very distinct categories. What we call immediacy data, which has an effectiveness from the minute we see the data in the model space out to about 3 days at its peak and then trailing off to about 3 weeks. And then we have short-term data, which picks up at the end of the third week and goes out to about the end of the fourth month, maybe a little bit longer. And then we have the long-term data, which is from the fourth month onward. And there's various levels of granularity. We get a lot more data points for the immediacy, slightly less for short-term, slightly less for long-term, trailing off. And the long-term data is split into three sections itself. In about 2003, I think it was, started noticing that there was a hole, if you will, in our model space relative to a period of time from early 2012 until about May of 2013. It didn't concern me because at that point I was much more focused on the immediate kind of things. But as we've moved forward in time towards 2012, the hole in the data has not extended away from us. In other words, in 2003, the hole in the data was 9 years out. Well, here it is in 2010, and the hole in the data is 2 years out. So it's been moving upward through our data types as we've been moving those data types forward in time.
I see.
And we don't really understand why that data gap occurs. There could be any number of explanations for it, but it is worrisome.
Can you ascertain if there's a shadow government out there somewhere?
Oh, certainly. That is, I know beyond a shadow of a doubt, and I can give you an exact linguistic example of how I know this. There were certain government contracts that were posted a few years back, made available in Freedom of Information Act thing, and they just kind of had them posted out on the internet and swept them, and I used them in relative to the sweeping the site for the Council on Foreign Relations in order to get a base linguistic set for what I called the powers that be. And just recently I've encountered a very curious thing that I didn't notice initially, that in 1956 the language made a very distinct change from, let me see if I can put this the right way, exploration of what you and I would think of as the hidden kind of technology involved in UFOs and so forth.
Right.
And after 1956, the language in the federally released contract documents changed to exploitation. So they had their success in 1956. From that point on, they've been able to engineer and do stuff on their own, and they've been exploiting the technology, and it just got larger and larger and larger. And then, of course, I started recently reading Richard Dolan's books, and that really confirms it.
Are you getting more and more chatter of this push for one world government for control?
That's a curious kind of a thing, because there's certainly more push towards control, but from the viewpoint of the linguistics, bearing in mind, of course, that we can't tell between a headline that gets it wrong and the occurrence itself, because we're sort of looking really at the headlines of newspapers through a blurry screen several days out, and if the writer of the report for the headline got it wrong, then we'll get it wrong. But given that, I think the push towards a one-world government is rather spurious, and it's one of those distraction memes that they run to keep everybody running around chasing an illusionary ghost.
One of the things,
go ahead, George.
By the way, that around this 1956 date, don't forget that back in 1961, President Eisenhower gave his famous speech on the military-industrial complex. And so whatever was going on drove a sitting U.S. president to come out and say some really startling things. And that means that if you look back in that 56, 57 era, something really did likely change. Now, whether it's reverse engineering Roswell or however,
I still maintain it is. I still maintain it was some kind of a brilliant success that occurred in the early days of February, maybe into March, because that's when the language radically changed.
And that's when U.S. foreign policy. I mean, there's a whole lot of stuff that started changing in the early '60s, and the veils of secrecy really came down.
And see, I'm actually of the opinion now, as goofy as it sounds, I say I have to agree with the smart thinkers that are actually schooled and lettered, like Richard Sauter and Mr. Dolan and others, who are of the opinion that there's a breakaway civilization. And I agree with that. And I believe that the civilization from the viewpoint of the shadow government part of the U.S. got its real impetus in 1956 and onward. So they've had a number of decades to get it all together. And I think they've either achieved Type 1 status or they're about to. Type 1 status would be the ability to be interplanetary in our solar system.
What do you think of the Kennedy assassination? And are old events too old to affect what you're doing today?
No, because things like that are continuing memes that are constantly reoccurring, and in fact, they're within our data. Every time we do a sweep, we'll find new areas discussing that kind of thing, and there's been a huge growth in that particular meme since about, let's say, 98, and we're seeing maybe a 10,000 to or larger % increase since I originally encountered that data stream in 98. So
part of that, George, is just the general public is waking up that conspiracy theories are only called theories by people who don't want you necessarily thinking about this stuff.
That's true. That's absolutely true. So in theory, we could use your work for going into all kinds of things like that.
Yes. Basically, our work is actually based on an ancient Roman technique called sked. At the time, it was SCED, and it's basically the language used betrays the domain of the speaker, and it's a way you could ascertain as a debater how to approach and attack your opponent. Bearing in mind that in Roman times this was really very pertinent because it was whoever was the better speaker that was elected to their Senate pretty much that day, kind of a deal. So indeed we can approach things and analyze them linguistically and build the model around even past events if we have enough data in it. Yes.
And SCED, by the way, George, is easily remember as subject knowledge elucidates domain.
Perfect. How can people use this in their everyday life to better themselves?
Put in garden, build boat, move to high ground.
or do you actually mean use the technology itself?
The technology.
That's really difficult at the moment. I've had a number of people offer to buy the stuff from me, and one guy wanted to buy it and try and encapsulate it in a PC sort of a program.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is the amount of bandwidth required to do it. My poor assistant here, Igor, has to have a special refrigerator in the room of his barn because there's so much excess heat kicked out by the servers, and we run a huge electricity bill every month. So it's not something you can. It's one of these things where better off not doing it at home.
Yeah, exactly, folks. Don't do this at home. Probably. When we come back, let's talk about some of the work that you're doing with halfpasthuman.com and explain what that all means. Our two special guests tonight, George Ure, Clif High, WebBot Technology. Their websites are all linked up right now at coasttocoastam.com. Now take some notes. When you hear George Ure and Clif High talking about things that are going to happen in 2010 and in the next few years to come, you can use that information to your own benefit, to your own gain. So get ready. More with the WebBot Technology on Coast to Coast AM. Gentlemen, tell me about halfpasthuman.com. Tell me about this site.
Well, that's basically where we announce and post our reports that are for sale. We've taken the output of the WebBot stuff here, and I write up reports that I try and keep under 60 or 70 pages. They're posted off there on a Buy Now button for $10 for anybody that cares to get into it. And some of the material within the reports I also post as articles, and especially if we can do graphics that will illustrate some of the more obtuse points around time.
What the heck is hyperchronism?
About maybe 2003, wasn't it, George? We started picking up on surreal.
Yeah, surreal and people not understanding what's going on around them.
And so probably around 2003, somewhere on this planet, we started seeing, I guess, an organized, if you will, or at least a very well-funded approach into the investigation of time. And they were probably doing these things called closed time-like loop constructs, which is this like little magnetic bubble. It is my theory that when they do that, they do it for, well, we know that they do it for a couple of different reasons. They create these bubbles to either screen out time stuff for the things inside the bubble or to concentrate time stuff. And if we look at it a particular way, what they're actually doing is they're creating a filter that screens out some of the ability of time to reach the interior of this bubble. So, for instance, if they wanted to slow down a chemical reaction and watch it occur in real time but extremely slow, they would put it in the middle of the bubble and then screen out the time stuff so that less time got into the bubble and so the reaction went slower. Or, for instance, if they wanted to do away with radioactive waste, they could put it in the bubble and concentrate the time stuff, and the radioactive waste would decay to harmless real quick. You could also, for instance, theoretically stick a wounded individual in the time bubble and give them more time stuff, and they would heal quicker relative to the real time around them. Now, it's my supposition that from 2003 onward, some of these people were having success, and that a strange effect occurred, that these bubbles actually create, let's imagine ourselves as pie dough.